I went camping one winter weekend when the nights were supposed to drop close to freezing. It was one of those trips where the cold makes you prepare differently. You double-check your sleeping bag rating, you bring extra layers, and you keep the fire burning longer than usual before crawling into the tent. I had gone alone, as I often did back then, because I liked the silence of it. The world always felt cleaner in the woods at night, stripped down to firelight, smoke, and the dark pressing in on all sides. The campsite I chose sat in a small clearing surrounded by tall pines. The ground was dry and soft with a thick layer of pine needles, and a faint smell of resin lingered in the air even after sundown. By the time I had the tent pitched and the fire going, the temperature was already sliding down fast. The night air carried a crisp bite, and I could see my breath when I leaned back in my camp chair. I cooked something simple over the fire, ate slowly, and watched the flames collapse into glowing red embers. The silence after the fire died down was absolute, broken only by the occasional snap of a branch deep in the woods. I pulled on every extra layer I had, crawled into my tent, zipped the sleeping bag up tight, and lay there listening to the night. At first it was just the usual mix of noises, the faint rustle of leaves, the creak of a tree in the wind, the distant call of something I couldn't place. But then, after an hour or two, I felt it, a weight sudden and solid against my back. It wasn't subtle, the kind of weight that makes the ground shift a little, that presses into you in a way no falling branch or gust of wind could. My body went rigid instantly, heart slamming against my ribs. The fabric of the tent pressed closer against me, and I could feel warmth, real warmth, coming through from the other side. My first thought was bear, though where I was, big cats weren't impossible either. The way it leaned against me wasn't the heavy push of claws or aggression. It was steady, almost casual, like something had chosen to lie down against me for its own comfort. Still, every nerve in me screamed to stay still, to not breathe too loud, to not move a muscle. The warmth didn't shift for a long while. I lay there, frozen, trying to keep my breathing shallow. Every small sound seemed amplified, the rustle of the nylon against fur, the faint thud of my own heartbeat in my ears. At one point, I thought I heard a low rumble, not sharp, not threatening, more like the slow release of air from deep in a chest. My skin crawled, but I stayed perfectly still. Minutes stretched like hours. My mind ran through scenarios. What would happen if I shifted? If the weight decided I wasn't worth ignoring? The tent wall was so thin it felt useless, like a tissue between me and whatever was out there. I wanted to believe it would move on, lose interest, wander back into the trees. But instead it pressed closer, its warmth soaking into the side of my body, almost like the way my own house cat used to curl against me on cold nights. That thought unsettled me even more. At some point in the night, maybe hours later, the weight eased off. The warmth left, and I heard the faint crunch of steps retreating across the pine needles. The silence that followed felt almost deafening. I lay there the rest of the night, still frozen, waiting for it to return. When the first gray light of morning came through the tent fabric, I finally unzipped the door and stepped outside. My breath fogged in the air, and the forest looked calm and ordinary, the kind of stillness that made me wonder if the night had been some long, stretched-out dream. But then I saw them, prints in the soft ground near my tent. They weren't small. Each paw print was wide, with clear indentations from pads and claws. Not a dog, not anything domestic. These were heavy, deliberate tracks, and they circled close, right up against the side of the tent where I had felt that weight pressing into me. I crouched down and set my hand against one of the prints. My fingers didn't even reach the edges. The sight of those tracks made the memory of the night slam back into me full force. It hadn't been imagination. Something large, something wild, had lain against my tent in the cold dark and stayed there long enough for me to feel its warmth seep through. I followed the trail a few steps into the trees, but it vanished quickly into the forest floor, lost among leaves and pine needles. I packed up quickly after that. Every sound in the woods felt heavier. Every shadow stretched longer. I didn't run, but I didn't waste time either. By the time I reached my car, I could still feel that phantom weight against my back, like a reminder pressed into my muscles. Later, when I thought about it, the thing that struck me wasn't just the fear, It was the strangeness of how it happened. If whatever it was had wanted me gone, I would have been gone. But it hadn't attacked, hadn't ripped through the tent or circled with aggression. It had simply pressed close, maybe chasing warmth, maybe curious, maybe just resting. The way a house cat does when it tucks itself against your back on a cold night. Only this had been no house cat. That night taught me something about the thin line between safety and chance in the woods. Out there, your tent isn't a wall. It's not a shield. It's a thin layer of fabric, and what's on the other side chooses whether you're left alone. Even now, years later, I can still feel that weight, still remember the warmth bleeding through the nylon, still hear the faint rumble in the dark. It chills me, but at the same time, part of me wonders if it was just what it seemed in the moment. A big predator, wild and dangerous, lying down like nothing more than a huge cat, seeking heat in the freezing night. That's the thought that has stayed with me most of all. How thin the line really is between terror and something almost tender, and how, in the middle of the woods with nothing but a tent around you, you can end up caught right between the two. I went camping alone one autumn weekend, far out in a stretch of forest that I had only read about in a few scattered trail reports. It was the kind of place where the trees grow so thick that sunlight only reaches the ground in thin strips, and where the silence has a weight to it, as if the woods themselves are holding their breath. I had been craving that silence, the break from everything man-made, and I packed my gear with the idea that I'd hike deep, set up camp by a small creek, and spend a couple nights there with nothing but the fire and the cold air around me. The trail in was barely visible after a few miles. Fallen branches blocked the way, and the ground was littered with leaves that muffled each step. I had to check my compass often to keep a sense of direction. It was the kind of wilderness where you felt like you were walking further away from the world with every step, and it gave me both a sense of freedom and a quiet unease that kept creeping in at the back of my mind. I reached the creek by late afternoon. The water ran shallow but fast, with clear pools forming where stones broke the current. I found a flat patch of ground nearby, enough space to pitch my tent, gather firewood, and keep everything close. By the time I had the tent up and my pack stored, the light had already started to thin, leaving the woods dim and full of shadows. I worked quickly to get a fire going, because I knew how quickly the cold would set in once night arrived. When the flames finally caught and began to spread warmth, I let myself relax a little. I heated a simple meal and listened to the sound of the creek. Every so often I'd hear the crack of a branch deeper in the trees, but that wasn't unusual. Forests are full of small movements. Squirrels, birds, raccoons, it could be anything. I told myself that over and over, but the stillness that followed each sound seemed heavier than I was used to. By full dark, the temperature dropped quickly. I fed the fire and pulled my jacket tighter. My plan was to sit by the flames for a while, then turn in, but a noise carried in from the distance that froze me in place. It was faint at first, almost like wind moving oddly through the trees. Then it rose, long, low, and carrying a sharp edge. A howl. I had heard recordings before, but hearing one in the middle of the woods, with nothing around me but thin fabric and open air, sent a weight straight into my chest. It wasn't close, but it wasn't far either. Maybe a mile away, maybe less. I sat there, staring into the fire, every muscle stiff. My mind started to run through everything I had read about wolves. They're territorial, they're cautious around humans, and actual attacks are rare. But knowing something in theory and hearing that sound while alone in a forest are very different things. The silence after the howl made me listen harder than I ever had in my life. I tried to steady myself, kept adding wood to the fire, and focused on the crackle. The flames became my shield, my one source of comfort. Time passed slowly, and eventually I told myself it was just passing through, that the wolf was calling to others, nothing more. I crawled into my tent, zipped it tight, and lay down with my knife close at hand, though I knew it was laughable against something like that. I must have dozed, because the next time I opened my eyes, the fire outside had died to embers. The air inside the tent was cold and still. Then I heard it again, but closer this time. A low, drawn-out howl that echoed through the trees and seemed to vibrate in the ground beneath me. My stomach turned heavy, and I held still, listening. I could make out the faint crunch of something moving through leaves. Slow steps, careful ones. I told myself not to move, not to make a sound. The tent fabric was thin enough that I could hear the rhythm of my own breathing, too loud in the silence. The steps grew clearer, and then they stopped just beyond the tent. The stillness was suffocating. My hand closed tighter around the knife, though my brain kept telling me that it was useless. Through the fabric, I could see the faintest outline, something tall enough to cast a shape in the moonlight. The weight of its presence made every second feel like it was stretching into hours. I don't know how long it stood there, but eventually the sound of its breathing reached me. Deep, steady breaths only feet away. Then it shifted, the soft scrape of claws against the ground. It moved slowly around the tent, circling, stopping, then starting again. I stayed frozen, heart pounding so hard I thought it would give me away. The urge to bolt, to unzip the tent and run into the darkness, was overwhelming, but reason pinned me down. Running in the dark forest would only make me pray. At one point, it brushed against the side of the tent. The canvas pushed in slightly, right where my shoulder was. I felt the warmth of its body through the thin material. My skin went cold, every muscle locked. It lingered there, pressing lightly, as if testing the barrier between us. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. And then, as suddenly as it started, it eased away. The sounds shifted, paws crunching against the leaves again. The steps moved off, slow at first, then fading deeper into the woods. Only when the silence returned did I let myself breathe again, shallow and shaking. I lay there the rest of the night, knife still in hand, listening for every small noise. Sleep never came. I waited for the first trace of daylight like it was the only thing that could save me. When the sky finally began to pale, I unzipped the tent and stepped out, my breath visible in the cold air. The forest looked normal again, quiet, almost calm, but the ground told a different story. Just feet from my tent, clear paw prints pressed deep into the earth. They were larger than my hand, each one sharp and defined in the damp soil. I traced them with my eyes, following the path as they circled the tent, over and over, before finally trailing back into the trees. I packed quickly, hands shaking with every movement. I didn't cook breakfast, didn't sit by the creek. I wanted distance, and I wanted it fast. As I shouldered my pack and started back through the woods, I kept checking the trees, scanning for movement. Every step out felt heavier, like the forest itself was holding on to me. I didn't relax until I saw the faint cut of the trail again, hours later. By the time I reached my car, I was drained in a way I had never felt before. Not just tired, but hollowed out, like something had pressed into me and taken away the part that trusted the quiet of the woods. Wolves are rarely dangerous to people, that's what all the books say. But rare doesn't mean impossible. What I felt that night was the clear truth of being watched, tested, measured as if I were nothing more than another animal out there. The forest went back to silence after I left. My tent, my fire, my little circle of human comfort. It all meant nothing to what moved in those trees. And though I walked away unharmed, I knew I had brushed against something raw and real, something that belonged far more to that wilderness than I ever could. I had been allowed to leave, but I could never forget how close it had stood, breathing in the dark, only a thin layer of fabric between us. That trip cured me of wanting to camp alone deep in the woods. The memory of those prints circling my tent has never left me, and I know it never will. I went camping at Ginny Springs in Florida about 10 years ago. Back then, I was still in my 20s and had this obsession with camping in different places across the state. I loved how each spot felt unique. Different trees, different sounds at night, different types of silence. Ginny Springs was a place I had heard about plenty of times, mostly from people who liked tubing or diving. But for me, it was about pitching a tent, making a fire, and spending the night tucked away in the woods. It was late summer, humid enough that the air felt heavy even in the evening. The sky that day had been clear, and I remember walking around, taking in the water, the tall oaks, and the way Spanish moss hung like old curtains from the branches. There were other groups scattered around the campground, families, couples, college kids. It wasn't crowded, but it wasn't empty either. I picked a spot not too close to others, but not so far that I felt isolated. I set up my tent under a patch of trees where the ground was flat and dry, then gathered some wood and lit a fire before the light started to fade. The first part of the night was calm. I cooked something simple, sat by the fire, and listened to the mixed sounds of people far away. Laughter, faint music, the splash of water somewhere deeper in the springs. Then, as it grew darker, all that noise thinned out. By the time I put out my fire and crawled into my tent, the campground had quieted down. Only the insects and the occasional hoot of an owl broke the silence. I don't know how long I had been lying there when it happened, but sometime in the middle of the night, a sound tore through the air so loud and so deep that I felt it in my chest. It was the unmistakable crash of a huge tree falling. I had heard things like that in movies or TV shows, the exaggerated cracking and splintering, but hearing it in real life was something else. It started with the sharp snap of wood giving way, then a rushing roar as the trunk toppled, branches breaking and tearing through others on the way down, until it slammed into the ground with a thud that seemed to shake the earth. At first I just lay there, staring at the nylon roof of my tent, heart thudding fast, ears ringing from how loud it was. In my head, I pictured some massive oak crashing down somewhere in the campground, but I told myself it was probably far enough away not to worry about. Trees fall in the woods sometimes. It's nature. I rolled onto my side, tried to steady my breathing, and forced myself to think it was nothing more than part of the forest doing what forests do. Maybe 10 minutes later, the quiet broke again. This time it wasn't wood or branches, it was voices. Dozens of them, maybe more. At first it was scattered, like murmurs carried on the night air. Then it grew into a full chorus of shouting, urgent tones, and footsteps rushing over dirt. My stomach dropped when I realized it wasn't just people talking. It was the kind of noise people make when something bad has happened. I unzipped the tent and stepped out into the night. The air felt thicker outside, the humidity mixing with the smell of crushed leaves and splintered wood. I could see lights from flashlights bouncing in the trees a short distance away, and the cluster of voices grew louder as I moved toward them. My own section of the campground had been quiet, but now it felt like all attention had shifted to one spot. When I got closer, I saw it, the tree that had fallen. It was massive, at least a couple feet wide, sprawled across the ground like some giant log dropped out of the sky. The trunk had torn through another smaller tree as it came down, and its limbs stretched out in all directions. What froze me wasn't the tree itself, but where it had landed. A tent had been crushed underneath, flattened into the dirt with canvas torn and poles bent like straws. People stood around it, their voices mixing into a blur of panic and urgency. Some had their hands pressed against the tree, others were trying to pull back parts of the tent. I stood there, not moving, my body buzzing with shock. It was closer than I wanted to admit. If the tree had fallen at a different angle, it could have been my tent under there. The thought hit me hard, like a cold hand on the back of my neck. I stayed at the edge of the crowd, watching as more people hurried over. Someone must have called for help, because the noise soon carried beyond the campground. The night turned chaotic. Headlights from cars lit up patches of trees. More flashlights darted across the ground, and the sound of shouting carried out into the distance. I saw people trying to lift pieces of the trunk, others cutting away branches to get to the tent beneath. I didn't need anyone to explain. I already knew that someone had been inside that tent when the tree came down. Time dragged on, but eventually I heard the heavy thump of rotor blades in the distance. A helicopter. Its sound grew louder until it hovered overhead, the wash of wind from its blades pushing down through the treetops. Emergency crews arrived, their uniforms catching the glare of lights, their movements quick and sharp. I watched them work, watched as equipment was pulled out, watched as they cleared enough space to reach what was left of the tent. When they finally carried someone out, strapped to a stretcher, the weight of the reality hit me full force. The person didn't move. Their body looked limp, their face obscured, but there was no mistaking the truth of it. The voices around me quieted, but the tension grew heavier. The helicopter circled low, then lowered itself enough for the stretcher to be loaded in. Within minutes, it lifted off again, disappearing into the dark sky with a sound that lingered even after it was gone. Afterward, the campground didn't return to normal. People stood around in stunned silence, some whispering, some just staring at the tree like it was a monster that had crawled out of the ground. I went back to my own tent, but I couldn't bring myself to get inside. I sat on the ground, knees pulled up, staring at the trees above me. Every branch seemed heavier than before. Every creak of wood made me flinch. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I kept thinking about how random it was, how a tree could stand for decades and then in one moment give way and fall, crushing whatever happened to be beneath it. It didn't matter that it was a campground, a place where people came to relax and escape. The forest didn't care. Nature moved on its own terms, and sometimes it decided to remind us just how fragile we really were. When the sun finally came up, I packed quickly. I could see others doing the same, their movements hurried, eyes tired, faces pale. No one lingered for breakfast or morning swims. The campground felt hollow, like the night had drained it of all the joy people had carried in. Driving away, I kept looking in the rearview mirror at the trees shrinking behind me. That sound of the tree snapping and falling has never left me. Even now, years later, when I hear wood crack in the woods or a branch give way, my stomach tightens and my chest gets heavy. It's a reminder that no matter how peaceful or beautiful a place seems, danger can come without warning. And sometimes it doesn't come with teeth or claws. It comes with something as simple as a tree giving way in the night. That trip changed the way I see camping. I still go, but I never look at the trees above my tent the same way again. Every campsite I pick now, the first thing I do is scan the trees, check for dead limbs, lean away from trunks that look too tall or too old. I can't shake the memory of standing there in the dark at Ginny Springs, staring at that crushed tent, and knowing how close it could have been me. That night made me realize the forest doesn't have to chase you to remind you how small you are. It can just let gravity do the work.